Welcome back to the Conflicts of Interest show. I am the co-host Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
I'm good. How you doing, Kyle, and all the people out there listening?
Doing all right. It's Wednesday morning here as we're set to record this. Assange is still on trial for extradition, and a whole bunch of stuff going on in Afghanistan that I want to talk about today. So I think we got a pretty important list for the show today, including some news on Yemen, which we haven't got a chance to talk a lot about yet on conflicts of interest, but it's extremely important to us. And we have a huge number of episodes that we covered that back on the old show, Foreign Policy Focus. And just a quick reminder to any foreign policy focused listeners, try to switch over to the new conflicts of interest feed and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And Will, you ready to get into this?
Yeah, man, let's do it.
All right, Will. So not long before we were set to go on here, I came across this breaking news that the city of Louisville is agreeing to a $12 million settlement with Breonna Taylor's family. And then for people who can see the Twitter feed, there's a couple other things they're agreeing to do. More social workers to help with mental health problems, incentives for officers to live in the city. So rather than having your officer come from two towns over, they live where they work. And then commanding officers must approve search warrants. So we could get into a little bit of the details of this Breonna Taylor case to explain why maybe that point's important. But of course, the big headline news here is the $12 million paid to the family. So for people who don't remember, I'd say it's like at least 6 months ago now. Will, not long after the shooting of Duck and Lemp, the police kicked down the door of Breonna Taylor's home in the middle of the night. Her boyfriend understood this to be a break-in, and I believe is believed to have fired at police. Police blindly fired back into the dark building, including possibly through a window, murdering Breonna as she slept next to her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was shot in the leg. Police did the dirty tricks that police usually do and tried to bully the boyfriend into essentially accepting a plea deal to get him off for shooting the cop in exchange for admitting that Breonna was somehow involved in illicit activities that would have justified the police uh, you know search there. I guess a couple important things is this was one of the no knock raids, and that's kind of the mantle that Rand Paul has took up and actually introduced the Breonna Taylor Act in the Senate to federally ban no knock raids. I think for me though, the thing that struck me was the $12 million and how there's some people, it seems like especially the mayor of Louisville, who are kind of touting this as this is us doing the right thing. And it's the biggest con ever. This is a city who's taking $12 million from the taxpayer, not holding a single public official, not a cop, not a supervisor, not an officer, not the police chief, not the mayor. Nobody is being held responsible for this. And then they're going to take $12 million from the taxpayer and give it to Breonna Taylor's family. And I'm not saying the family isn't maybe owed money, but it's certainly not on every single citizen of Louisville to cough up 20 or so dollars for this. And then from the mayor's perspective, to take like kind of almost a victory lap on this, or in some way to pretend like he did anything by taking money from some people and giving it to a victim of his crime, is just, it shocked and disgusted me. And so I don't know. I guess this is kind of the the status quo that we usually deal with, right? Will, is that they do something wrong and then they claim victory because they're the government, and a lot of people just praise them, and that's how it goes. So I don't know, what details of this story do you want to fill in, and what do you think about the settlement?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a pretty good job just covering like the factual basis of it. One other thing I had seen, and I think you actually did kind of hit on this, that the settlement does not explicitly acknowledge like wrongdoing by any particular officer. And so, like, I mean, I don't know what paying $12 million to the family is. I mean, you'd think that's sort of an acknowledgement that, hey, we screwed up here or something. But I don't think there was an explicit like, mea culpa in this settlement. So I thought that was interesting. And yeah, I mean, you hit on this point. I think this is a great point that I think often libertarians are the only ones to make. That indeed, when the government is paying out this $12 million settlement, who's paying that? Is that coming out of the officer's salaries? Like, no, that's coming out of the average person's salary, the average taxpayer. And so that's that. It's not that I'm not happy to see that the Breonna Taylor's family is getting some restitution for this, but who's paying it? Who's footing that bill? And it's certainly not the people who are responsible for the act.
Right. Well, the other thing it seems to me is that the reforms here are pretty minor, although I understand that I believe the state of Kentucky already banned no knock grades in response, which is, a good thing. But just having the chief sign off on or the commanding officer sign off on the warrant is a pretty small step. It's not having, officers double check their addresses and stuff like that. Or I think the most important thing to make sure police officers aren't kicking down the wrong doors is to charge officers who do, which is what should happen here. And this is, I think, just another way to try to deflect from the fact that the officers need to be held accountable, and that's ultimately what's going to I think end up curbing the police abuse at least a little bit. Is that if you kick down the wrong door and shoot the wrong lady and then you spend the rest of your life in jail, I guarantee you nobody, else on that police force, they're going to remember that. And, they're going to double check their stuff when they're getting warrants. And they're going to, make sure they really consider, do we want to just go kicking down this person's door in the middle of the night? Or are there other ways that we could, attempt to apprehend them? Breonna Taylor, one of the things about her was this was not a lady who was actually like, I guess, in the drug world. It seems like maybe she was at one time involved with somebody who was using, but she was like a paramedic or an EMT or something. Like, this was a lady who had like a job that like you could meet her at her job because she shows up there every day, right? And talk to her if you have any concerns or something like that. There's no reason, to be the Gestapo and kick down doors in the middle of the night with your guns and waving them around and shooting people. And this is exactly what happens when you go kicking down doors in the middle of the night. Is people get scared and shoot back because some
Yeah.
people, live in neighborhoods or lived in neighborhoods, or people may have a little PTSD or some history of trauma or something a little bit more sensitive to this kind of thing. Or hell, even people who live in a nice neighborhood, get scared because people kick down the door in the middle of the night. You expect the police to go like the cop shows where you, if there's cause to kick down the doors, there's like 4 police helicopters outside circling around and saying like, come out with your hands up, come out with your hands up. And that's not at all what you had here. It was just middle of the night, get down the door. I remember not that long ago I saw a video of there's like a police officer that approached a house in the middle of the night with his hand behind his back and like didn't say what he was doing there, right? So he's like got his hand behind his back, and I'm assuming the guy who comes to the door is thinking that this cop is like some guy trying to mug him or something. And I think the cop actually says police, but he was playing close. So like, how is this guy gonna know? Like, I feel
Yeah.
like if I was trying to rob somebody for some money, I'm not above saying I'm the cops, right? Like, if I'm pointing a gun at somebody, I'm willing to say I'm the cops. And so, anyways, a shootout ensues, and this guy dies. And again, it just seems like had you uniformed police officer shows up, knocks on the door, not hands in pockets or anything like that, then there's no reason for this like violent confrontation, anyways. And so, and again, with this settlement and everything the city is doing, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot they're doing other than just ending the no knock raids, which I'm guessing there's gonna be some loopholes, and maybe cops just won't say it very loud or something, like real quietly. um
Right.
yeah, so I think that's I think this is a pretty empty gesture from especially the government. And again, I'm not like upset that the family got some money. I mean, this is
Of
extremely
course.
tragic. And I guess in some way it probably will screw up the city budget a little bit. And from my understanding, a lot of times cities actually have insurance policies against this, and so it's likely an insurance company will pay out the $12 million, but the city's insurance rates will go up, and so it's going to end up costing every citizen either now or later.
Right.
Um,
Someone's got to pay for that at some
right.
point. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, anything else on this, Will, or anything else the crazy cops are doing on our streets, or should we talk about what our soldiers are doing on the streets of other countries?
Yeah, I suppose we can move on to the move abroad if you want.
Yeah. All right. So next up, we have a story here, or a couple actually, on Afghanistan. The first is U.S. Commander. This is General Kenneth McKenzie. Intel still hasn't corroborated Russia bounty story, written up by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He says months after the New York Times reported Russia secretly offered bounties to the Taliban to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan, a top commander says a detailed review of all available intelligence found no corroboration of the story. So, I guess, Will, for anybody who wasn't willing to listen to the analysis that me and you put forward months ago, when we explained that, look, the evidence isn't there, the NSA pretty quickly jumped on and was disputing this. And yet, I still see on Twitter, it's been, I think every single day, Senator Tammy Duckworth is tweeting. She was like on day 80 last week. It's been 80 days and Donald Trump still hasn't responded to the Russians paying bounties on U.S. soldiers. So, what do you think of the statement from General McKenzie?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've seen these Russian bounty claims that originated in the New York Times. They've been floating around for like 2 months now, sort of unchallenged. Like you mentioned that the NSA, I think, anonymously had sort of questioned it. And I think also the Pentagon had even said something early on that like, hey, well, we haven't, as a preliminary matter, we have not seen any evidence for that. But now finally we do have the commander of CENTCOM coming on record and saying that, hey, we've seen no evidence to support this idea that the Taliban has been paying, the Russians have been paying the Taliban to kill American soldiers. One thing about what McKenzie did say, I believe he gave this to NBC News. He kept saying that the matter is still under investigation, like as if there could still be something to it. But like, I don't know, like you're telling me that after 2 months of searching and turning up nothing, you're telling me there still might be something to that? I mean, like you'd think that after the original so-called evidence that was cited to base this claim, you'd think if that doesn't hold water. I mean, like we learned later after this was initially reported, we learned that these allegations come from interrogations of either criminals or low-level Taliban operatives in Afghanistan who may or may not have been tortured
By the Afghan forces, which is important, as you said, because they may or may not have been tortured.
Right.
Just to clarify, it wasn't done by some FBI agent using, even the tactics that they could use to get people to confess to murders they didn't commit here. The tactics are far more extreme than that in this case.
Right. And you would think that, like, if they looked into that initial claim, that an original intelligence, and that did not check out, you'd think that would kind of mean the whole thing is debunked. But McKenzie is kind of treating this like there's still some ongoing probe, like it might still find something. Seems like he's being a little too generous, I think, with the people making this claim. But like, nonetheless, in so many words, he did still like debunk it completely. You had another anonymous military.
Can I just add there, because I read that or heard that a little bit differently. I feel like sometimes the government will say that, and what he really means is like, we ongoing make sure that Russians aren't paying bounties to kill our troops in Afghanistan. I'm sure the U.S. has, these kind of counterintelligence operations ongoing, and they're always looking for this kind of information about, what's happening in Afghanistan related to, potential targets of U.S. soldiers or something like that. So I guess I kind of thought maybe he meant that in a very vague sense, like, we're always looking for this information. But I did feel like he was pretty much closing the book on this story. But maybe you had a little bit of a different take on that. So.
Yeah, a little bit. It just seemed like he's trying to debunk it, but at the same time, he's still trying to leave the door open a little bit. Like, I don't know. It just seemed like he's giving some of the critics, like, well, he didn't say, like, he said they're still looking or something. It just seemed like he was leaving it a little more, I don't know, not as definitive. But nonetheless, though, the NBC did cite another military official who, this one was anonymous, so it's a little less weighty. But they also said that the DoD had reviewed all intelligence around like every attack on American soldiers going back several years, and they still have found no indication of Russian payments. So again, like we have several, indications here that like this story is probably nonsense, as we sort of suspected all along, just based on like the shoddy sourcing and, just the implausibility of the claim. But of course, like this, even if McKenzie had left no door open, and even if the New York Times ran like a front page correction tomorrow saying that all the Russian bounties reporting was not legit, I think you'd still have people saying this, like you said, Tammy Duckworth tweeting about it. Like you're still going to have this claim is still probably not going to die, no matter how thoroughly it is debunked. Just like a lot of the other ridiculous crap that's been said about Russia in the last few years. I think this is sort of going to fall in that same category.
Wait, you mean 17 intelligence agencies didn't confirm Russia hacked the U.S. election? Is that, um,
I'm
but
sorry, let me reconsider. Yeah.
so, yeah. Anyways, that's a very important point that this isn't going to die and it's going to be an ongoing thing. And now even Iran has been rolled up in. I'm sure Iran's relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan is probably a little bit different than the Russians, just because they share a massive border that I think is often pretty hard to manage and not prevent people from walking back and forth and stuff like that.
Right.
I'm sure we're within months of the Chinese being accused of, paying the Taliban or somebody else to kill U.S. soldiers somewhere. That way, the Trump team could also get in on this narrative, like that. That seems to be the direction now of election interference, rather than saying that improving, that Russia didn't meddle in the 2016 election, at least not to any significant degree. People maybe talk about $46,000 on bad Facebook ads, some of them about puppies. Come on.
Right. Buff Bernie.
Right, Buff Birdie. That's the Russia election interference. But rather than the Trump administration making the point that it's not happening and it didn't happen, they seem to be now on kind of the bandwagon. Well, Russia's helping us, but China and Iran are helping Biden, so it all evens out. And it allows the hots to like kind of have their cake and eat it too, where the election gets to be legitimate, but foreign entities get to interfere, and so we could be hostile to countries that did absolutely nothing, and at the same time pretend we had a fair election, or whatever the hell that actually means. So I'm guessing that's the way this is going to go. And I guess for me, I just wanted to point out, I think the most compelling evidence that this didn't happen is nobody was able to identify any time that the Taliban received a payment in particular because an American soldier was killed. I guess
Right.
they allegedly could track some payments from the GRU to the Taliban, but they have no blips or anything like that. It's just the Russian government has some ties with the Taliban. In part, I think we're trying to pass them intelligence to take out the Islamic State Khorasan group, which Russia has just as much interest in getting rid of as the United States, if not a little bit more, since Afghanistan borders, I think, former Soviet republics, right? Uzbekistan and stuff like that.
Yeah, I
So,
think so.
Russia's obviously concerned about jihadist groups within Afghanistan, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if they had some relationship with the Taliban, especially since on the ground the Taliban have been, maybe next to like the U.S. Special Forces, some of the most effective fighters against the Taliban in is the Islamic State Khorasan group in Afghanistan.
Right.
Should
Right.
we move on to the tots, Will?
Yeah, but just one last thing I wanted to point out, just in terms of the Russian payments to the Taliban, like in general. I mean, look, the Americans have also been found to have made payments to the Taliban. Like we pay them, like a local commander for protection or something. So, like, you could read a lot into these Russian payments. I'm not sure what they say those are for. Obviously, they haven't proved they're for bounties, but still, like, I think I would also point to like, a lot of countries operating in Afghanistan have made payments to the Taliban.
Oh yeah. And this has been going on throughout the war. So the only way we could get supplies to some of our troops is to pay the Taliban they're fighting against to get them there. But
Exactly.
let's move on to a very Afghanistan headline we have here again at antiwar.com. This one by Jason Ditz. Intra-Afghan peace talks begin with clashes still continuing. So, they have delegations, both the Taliban and the Afghan government, and I believe the U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, is in Qatar as well. And Mike Pompeo actually made a stop there, although I doubt he stayed for more than a few hours to
Yeah.
be a part of like the opening, part of these talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. But this is going on in Qatar, while on the ground in Afghanistan, the fighting continues and people continue to die. So, that's a negative. But they're talking about a possibility of a nationwide ceasefire. I guess, Will, what optimism do you have for talks? And do you have any more details on the talks? As far as I could tell, it doesn't seem like I have a whole lot of optimism for anything at least happening fast. There seems to be, just issues around the Afghan government side having women on their team, and this is even a problem within Afghanistan's the Afghan government's own like negotiation team having women there. Then it's a bigger issue for the Taliban. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the details, like I don't think there's actually been a whole lot of reporting on what's actually been discussed there so far in Qatar there. I believe the first few days were like very preliminary. There was like an opening ceremony on Saturday, and then I think by Monday there was some kind of delay where they're having a dispute over like what the schedule and the agenda should be. So I think like the first actual like talks at all only started on Tuesday, and when we're recording now, that's only from like a couple hours from now, or a couple hours after. So we're still kind of waiting for like the real talks and negotiations to get started, but they are in Doha right now, and they are apparently doing these negotiations. I know that like one of the big, the major thing on the agenda is obviously figuring out some kind of ceasefire, or at the very least, some kind of reduction in violence. That's like a major goal of these talks ultimately. I'm not sure if they'd be able to hammer that out this week, but that is something nonetheless that they're going to be trying to start to figure out there. I know other things on the agenda include like figuring out some potential future power sharing arrangement, changes to the Afghan constitution, and sort of trying to reconcile this with the Taliban's view of like Islamic governance. There's some dispute there. As you were mentioning, there's the whole issue of women's rights, where I think the Taliban has actually kind of warmed up to this a little bit lately, where they are now open to having like women in the workplace and in schools, and even like female lawyers and judges and stuff. And as you mentioned too, there are I think four female negotiators on the Afghan government side, and apparently the Taliban hasn't like boycotted it over that. So I don't think it's been that massive of an issue. There may have been some dispute over that, but they're not saying that, hey, this is like beyond the pale. This ruins it for us. So I thought that was kind of interesting. In terms of details, though, we don't have that much in the reporting. I think we have to wait a little bit for that stuff to come out. I know they weren't allowing like any foreign official or any foreigner at all in the talks themselves. Like no American and no other foreign officials actually going to be allowed to sit in the room where they're talking. However, one other interesting thing I did see that I had not noticed before was that just recently the Taliban actually like at the last minute switched the leader of their negotiating team, where like less than a week ago they swapped out the guy who they had up there before, and they put in this other guy, Abdul Hakim Ishaqzai, who is, I guess, like a major, like a top cleric in the Taliban. And I guess he's more hardline a little bit and has more of a close relationship to the Taliban's like actual leader, Akhundzada. But I'm not totally sure what that signifies, whether that means they're taking some kind of harder stance, or whether that just means they want a higher level guy who can make decisions on the spot more. I think they had shuffled some people around on the negotiating team before that, and putting up more like leadership figures on the team. So that might be all it is, that they just want to be able to make more decisions without having to like relay things, up the chain of command or whatever. But I did think that was an interesting development, that just like a few days before this big negotiations, they like swapped out the lead of the negotiating team.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I've, often wondered if the Taliban did make a deal with the Afghan government, how much of the Taliban are necessarily then signed on and guaranteed to go on with the deal. It seems like a pretty fractured organization to me, and not necessarily one where it's that every commander is going to go with the decisions of, the Taliban, and that certainly it seems like in some cases the Taliban is just like the local drug lord, or who in the Western media at least could tell the difference between a Pashtun fighting the Afghan government over drugs, or over Taliban ideology, insurgency and stuff like that. So I guess maybe even having the more hardline approach would be better, just because this person is maybe more reflective of the Taliban overall, or something like that. And I mean, it's important to negotiate a deal that is going to be followed by, the actual Taliban on the ground. I mean, it would be
Right.
great to declare a ceasefire tomorrow, and women's rights and all of that, but if that means that the Taliban just carry out like suicide attacks all day, well, that's not necessarily better. If you could come to some kind of agreement that's actually going to commit people to being peaceful, that I think that's what you're looking for. So hopefully whatever happens and comes out of it, this person is the right person to be in charge of the negotiations and can make that happen. Also, I guess who knows, like who has relationships in Afghanistan? Maybe this guy, went to school with some guy on the team, the Afghan government negotiation team a long time ago, and they have like a decent relationship. Like that could mean a hell of a lot more than people's actual personal beliefs in this kind of situation. If you look across from the table and the other guy across from you is like some old guy you used to hang out with, he's a human being. And so that means, I'm guessing, a lot in these kind of situations, as far as like just being willing to sit and talk through and negotiate and making the deals that need to be made to finally bring peace to Afghanistan.
Right, absolutely.
Next up, I guess, talking about bringing peace to Afghanistan, we have a pretty big announcement, and this is something that I think we talked about on Foreign Policy Focus now in the early episodes of this show, which is that William Ruger is the hopefully new ambassador to Afghanistan. Will Ruger has a history with the Charles Koch Institute and was a naval officer decorated for her service in Afghanistan. And as Pat Buchanan points out in this article, has long championed a non-interventionist foreign policy. Now, I don't think Will Ruger is Will Porter, not to get the two confused or anything like that on foreign policy and anti-war ideas. However, he does want to get the hell out of Afghanistan, and so I think well, Pat's article here at Anti-War may be just a little optimistic overall about what he thinks this means for Trump's foreign policy overall. This I think to both me and you, Will, is very encouraging to see the placement of Ruger as ambassador to Afghanistan, and along with naming Doug McGregor ambassador to Germany. So assuming both of those get approved, let's talk a little bit about what that could mean for policy specifically in Afghanistan, but we can mention Germany as well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, unfortunately, this is kind of coming late in Trump's term, like to where it would, not, if he loses in November, this might not make any difference at all. And of course, that also like depends on whether the Senate confirms him, which I'm actually not even sure when that's supposed to happen. I was trying to look for a date for the Senate confirmation for Ruger, and I can't find anything. I'm not even sure when they're supposed to do that. But nonetheless, like if this guy does get in there, I think it does, he certainly could push things in a good direction. I think like it's better to have a like more non-interventionist ambassador there than one who's going to constantly be going to the president saying like, we need more troops. We need more bloodshed. But yeah, I mean, this Ruger guy has shown pretty good like chops on Afghanistan. Like he's been arguing to get out of the country 100% even before there was a peace deal or any kind of withdrawal deal at all with the Taliban. He was just saying, just do it yesterday, like as soon as possible. We just need to get out and end this war now. And that is kind of consistent with his, like you mentioned, he's involved with the Charles Koch Institute. He's also some kind of foreign policy researcher at Cato. So he is kind of in like the Beltway libertarian like orbit, like he's kind of in that world. And so like his positions do seem to reflect that. He's also backed Trump's overtures toward getting out of Syria. So I think that also kind of like sets him apart from a lot of the foreign policy establishment. Like that issue of Syria is kind of like, I don't know, you can kind of tell where somebody stands depending on where they stand on the Syria issue. And the fact that he's just 100% like behind just getting out of there, I think that does kind of bode well for his like overall stance on these questions. Again, it is true that ambassadors, it's not as if they're, single-handedly making policy. But again, it's they're in an influential position to the president, to where like I'd rather have a dove in there than a hawk, obviously.
Right. Well, I think especially when you look at Trump's administration, and it seems that he is able to be influenced, but does have these tendencies to be non-interventionist, or at least less interventionist than others. And to have the personnel and the positions needed to carry out those policies is, I think, something that's really prevented Trump's, some of his non-interventionist tendencies from taking over and actually, having anything happen on the ground. So having, this person that, this position is going to facilitate that rather than hinder it, which is what I think most other ambassadors end up doing it in this case. Same thing with Doug McGregor, where you now have this situation where he's hopefully going to end up being ambassador to Germany. But just today, I'm reading that the Air Force is saying that it's going to take them quite a long time. It's not going to happen very quick for them to transfer their stuff out of Germany. And it's like, if Trump was a little bit smarter, he would hear that and then go fire and replace whoever, either the commander of the Air Force or whoever is, like, I guess, in command of the Air Force forces for Eurocom, or whoever, the general or lieutenant general is that's making that call, and say, and hire somebody based on the fact that in 2 months they are going to be able to logistically get all the U.S. Air Force's operations out of Germany, right, or whatever the said goal is. And that's what who Trump needs to do. That's what who Trump needs to be, and that's who he never has been through his administration. And that's why he says, I'm getting out of Syria, and we're a year and a half or more now later, and we still have 500 troops there getting oil that's not even worth it out of the ground. For no sustainable or understandable reason, we're trying to squeeze a few thousand barrels of oil out of Syria a day. Again, had Trump just, when Mattis resigned over it, Trump should have said, good, I want to save American soldiers' lives. You obviously don't. I'm going to hire a Secretary of Defense who understands how to bring U.S. troops home, and then went and hired Dub Bandow. Instead, he went to, right, I think, Lockheed first and hired, or Boeing first and hired Patrick Shanahan, and then went to Raytheon and hired Mark Esper. Who are the same kind of warmongers that Trump 2 weeks ago or a week ago now was bashing in his speech, along with the top brass of the military, saying that the problem is that you generals go then work for these corporate lobbyists through the revolving door, all these weapons makers, and then you push more war. And then he hires them to be a Secretary of Defense, and he warns what the hell is going on in his administration. It's just unbelievable that it should be obvious now, and maybe these hirings are signs that it even is getting a little bit more obvious to Trump. But I'm not quite as optimistic as Pat Buchanan is yet. We'll go with that.
Yeah, agreed, definitely. Yeah, Trump definitely needs to exercise more of his apprentice muscles, where he needs to fire people when they don't carry out his vision.
I never watched the show, but I remember the "you're fired" line, and yeah,
that's all I know
been
about
really
too.
disappointed we haven't gotten one of those as president. We kind of did with James Comey, but it wasn't like the classic "you're fired." Like, I can't do the Trump accent thing, but he does the "you're fired" thing. That's fantastic. Right. Like, he could have done it to Comey, he could have done it to Mattis, he could have done it to McCabe.
He kind of did it to Bolton a little bit. He said Bolton's service will no longer be required. He said on Twitter.
I want the line. I want the line. Yeah, that would have been fantastic for John Bolton. But Will, let's move on to this story that you actually wrote up for RT. American spy charged with terrorism in Venezuela over alleged conspiracy to sabotage oil refineries and power plants. So is Maduro getting a little paranoid, or is there something to this, Will?
Yeah, that's actually something I'm still trying to figure out myself. The Venezuelans are claiming that another American mercenary was caught in their country, plotting sabotage, as you read in the headline, their oil refineries and power plants. However, I should say, Caracas has released virtually no evidence for this so far. This is all basically just based on what the Venezuelan government is claiming. But they do claim that this American, Matthew John Heath, that he worked for this private military contractor that's somehow connected to the CIA. And they say that he was caught with a group of Venezuelans in the country, in Venezuela, some of them in the military. And they were found with weapons, including a grenade launcher, I guess, and plastic explosives. They were found with bundles of American cash. And then apparently the cell phones they had contained photos of military installations and these energy facilities, which they're alleging, they were going to try to sabotage and blow up somehow. I guess presumably with the plastic explosives that they are said to have, that's allegedly found on them. This guy Heath was arrested last Friday, along with these 6 Venezuelans. There was a couple days of delay though before the chief prosecutor finally came out on Monday and declared that there would be charges for him. And he said it was in addition to terrorism, it's for what there's weapons trafficking charges and a conspiracy charge, which is kind of interesting because that's the exact same charges that those other Americans were hit with. Lucas Denman and Aaron Barry, those former Green Berets who were caught up in that whole crazy like incursion raid plot last May, who were arrested in Venezuela in May. We covered this too on your old show on Foreign Policy
Right,
Focus.
I'll go ahead and link
That
to that episode, and it was Silver Corp headed by Justin Guerdeau, right, that ran that operation.
Yeah, exactly. Silver Corp USA was this. I think they're based in Florida. There's this private mercenary firm, and these two former Green Berets, like apparently worked for this guy's company. And yeah, they were found in Venezuela with a group of like defectors, like I think like a couple dozen Venezuelans, and they were doing this like like a boat raid, like raiding the coast of Venezuela, where I guess the goal ultimately was to like abduct Maduro and take over an airport. The whole thing was like absolutely insane and wild, and like it sounds like it never could have possibly been feasible, but nonetheless that is what this Goudreau guy says that the plot was. However, for this more recent one with this Heath guy, like we haven't seen any of the kind of crazy stuff that came out with that last one. Like with that last story with Silvercorp, we eventually had like a contract that was signed up between the Venezuelan opposition and this company Silvercorp, and of course the U.S. heavily backs the Venezuelan opposition. So I don't know. There was all kinds of interesting stuff with that previous alleged mercenary plot. Nothing like that has come out for this Heath guy yet. But like we very well may. That's still pretty early. We might still see things like that to come out here.
Yeah, so a couple things when I read your story here, Will, that stood out to me. One, again, is that the evidence from the Venezuelan government seems lacking. And the other thing that kind of popped into my head is, other than maybe the pictures of the military installation, it sounded to me like this guy may be some kind of involved in drug trafficking, which is something that ends up happening with a lot of U.S. Special Forces after they get, not like a majority or anything, but a disproportionate number. You read a lot of stories about U.S. Former special operations, being involved in drug smuggling from Latin America back up to the U.S. In different kind of ways. And yeah, so it's definitely possible, that that's what was going on here. And then, you happen to find an American in Venezuela with a couple, a couple $1,000s in cash and some explosives and weapons. And I imagine that's pretty easy to spin into another coup attempt. And so the other thing that stood out to me was just that, while from especially an American, not being a Venezuelan within the country point of view, it seems like pretty thin evidence. But if I were a Venezuelan and, just a couple months ago, there's an admitted coup attempt against, Maduro with a couple Americans and a couple dozen Venezuelans, I would, be very willing to take the government's word for it that this happened again 3 months later, especially when the first case is so clear cut and open. Even if this one seems like there's some details missing to prove that, you may expect that they come out later. So I definitely wouldn't be surprised if Venezuelans are, eating this up, and it makes for very good propaganda for Maduro. And it's all because it was, justified by the previous attempted coup in May.
Right, right. And let's not forget too, there was another like U.S. backed like incursion or coup attempt back in I think like April of 2019, where the Venezuelan opposition just like tried to convince the security forces to defect, and but they failed. This whole thing fizzled. But nonetheless, that was like very openly U.S. backed, and the U.S. has been backing the so-called interim president Juan Guaido there for quite some time. And then like you're saying, the Venezuelans see certain things and it might make them might make this more plausible to them. They also see how the U.S. has been imposing sanctions on the country, how they've indicted Nicolas Maduro, the president, on like narco terrorism charges, how they've launched this like counter narcotics mission in the Caribbean with an eye on Venezuela. All these very hostile things toward the Venezuelan government. So yeah, they see all that kind of stuff, and they probably are more liable to believe these kind of claims about mercenary plots and stuff.
So, Will, if you're ready, I wanted to move on to this story about Yemen that I thought was pretty interesting. And is U.S. officials fear arrest over Saudi war crimes in Yemen. And this was, again, written up by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. A report from the New York Times reveals that some U.S. officials are concerned that their role in facilitating arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates while ignoring harm to civilians each country has caused in Yemen could lead to their arrest overseas for war crimes. And so a lot of countries have different kind of statutes that say like if you commit certain kind of horrendous crimes in other countries and are unaccountable for it, then you can be held either like, sent to the ICC, the Hague, the International Criminal Court, or just tried. Like I think Spain has a law where they could just try war criminals from any country, or it might be a different European country. Um, and so this could happen, I suppose. I think this was a real fear of some of the Bush era officials for the torture and rendition program, that
Yep.
they could end up having a layover in some European city and get arrested and stuff. And so I guess the detail that I thought was the most important that Dave has here in the second paragraph, the report said that officials from both the Obama administration and Trump administration have considered hiring lawyers. So this is two administrations here. The polar opposites. One, if you ask most people, one is absolutely good and one is absolutely bad. Obama and Trump. And yes, officials from both parties are now worried about being arrested for war crimes, for the genocide that they helped commit in Yemen. So take this where you want, Will. Talk about Yemen, talk about the war crimes, whatever you got.
Yeah, yeah. Like first, I'll give the usual caveat for stories that are just based on like anonymous sources, as this one is. This New York Times story. It's not something I'm taking as like 100%, irrefutable and rock solid. But the Times is saying that for this story, they got more than a dozen current and former officials to comment. A lot of them anonymously, but I do think that is like worth considering. That's quite a bit of people commenting here. But yeah, I mean, as you're saying, like some of these officials are at the point now where they're considering hiring lawyers and where they're thinking about the possibility that they could be arrested while they're, on vacation overseas, or for whatever reason overseas. And that's just like incredible. Like, afraid that their possible role in war crimes could, have consequences. And I mean, like the Saudis and the UAE and their whole coalition have definitely committed war crimes in Yemen. There's like absolutely no question about that. They've been consistently bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure for more than 5 years straight. And so that's like homes, hospitals, schools, farms, factories, warehouses, ancient cultural sites, school buses, funeral processions, like you name it in Yemen, the Saudis have dropped an American-made bomb on it for sure. So there's very little question about whether these war crimes have occurred, just in terms of the amount of bombing of civilians you're talking about here for such a sustained period of time. At one point several years ago, and this is like years ago, this isn't even recent, 60% of Yemen's healthcare facilities were reported damaged or destroyed by the bombing, meaning that not only that people can't get treatment for all kinds of injuries and ailments, including things like cholera and diphtheria, which Yemen has had outbreaks of recently, like during the war. But those damaged healthcare facilities also means that the official bodies can't count casualties because they rely on those hospitals and clinics to get those figures, as we covered many times on your previous show, and as I've written about. So we don't even really know like the true level of devastation that's been inflicted on Yemen. The latest figure I think we have from ACLED, like one of the few organizations that is still trying to keep track of this, I think their last figure was 112,000 in total. And that does count both civilians and combatants, but it is still like a very conservative estimate because it only includes people who are like directly killed in the fighting alone. The people who they can confirm are killed in the fighting alone. That doesn't even include the number lost to like deprivation that's directly related to the war, whether that means like, people starving to death or not getting the medicine they need or not having a hospital. The hospital's now too far away because the nearest one has been destroyed. So with all those things, considered, like the total, I think is going to be a lot larger than what ACLED's even estimating there. And it's not just been hospitals either. Like we're talking like a good chunk of Yemen's entire economy and society has been devastated in this war. At one point, the UN was estimating like 22 million Yemenis are reliant on some kind of international aid, whether that's food or medical aid or water or shelter. And we're only talking about a country of like 29 million people here. So like this is an absolute society-wide catastrophe that the Saudis have inflicted on Yemen. And they've done it with, as I mentioned, with American-made bombs. They're flying in American-made aircraft for a long time in the war, fueled midair by American tankers. I think they stopped doing that. They're bombing targets that are picked with American intelligence support, and they're doing all of this as the U.S. helps to run cover in places like the UN, like helping the Saudis avoid consequences. So this entire war could not happen without Uncle Sam's help. like whatever atrocities or war crimes the Saudis and the Emiratis and the coalition have committed here, the U.S.'s name is all over those. So like I think that might help to give some context for this New York Times report and why these officials, might be concerned. They might be shaking in their boots a little bit that they could face consequences here. And the last thing I will say is that I think they have even more reason to worry just because just this week, in fact, I think later Wednesday, they're going to touch on some of those arms sales to the Saudis in a House committee hearing. And so that might also be driving some of their concerns and driving sort of this like that. I think that's part of the reason why the Times did this report is because of this upcoming hearing.
Um, so the one thing I could kind of think to add on it is, and just from what I've have reported on it and read about before of the Yemen war and possible war crimes, a big part of it is the U.S. has actually helped the Saudis with intelligence and picking targets and stuff like that. And so that to me is probably what like is the legal justification that they're going to use to like open up this investigation, or at least what I would imagine would kind of be, because even up till now they say they help Saudis pit targets, and you point out them bombing like up to huge numbers of healthcare facilities, including at one point 60% being out of service. At one point they had built like this massive cholera treatment center, I think around Al Hodeida, and it was built or run by the Arab Red Crescent, which I believe is the equivalent to the Red Cross in the Arab world. And they actually ended up with that being bombed, had bombs dropped on the top of it with the big Red Crescent painting right on top of it. And then, of course, I always have to mention the great report from Martha Mundy and her analysis explaining that this is a food war against the people of Yemen.
Yeah.
Anything else on Yemen? Well, I think we probably need to like take some time and do a real thorough episode at some point on Yemen, detail, the players, what's going on there, debunk the lies about Iran and all of that. But for now, I think that kind of covers why officials and important both administrations that started in 2015 and continued under Trump are now concerned about this. And
yeah, I did have one final thing to add there. Just in addition to that House hearing, there was last week also a UN report that was on like atrocities committed in Yemen by the direct combatants in the war. But they did mention they did state that they could possibly refer actions to the International Criminal Court, or they're going to refer actions to the UN Security Council, who would then relay those to the ICC. And they didn't mention the U.S. by name in terms of like they committed war crimes. However, the U.S. is mentioned in that report in the sense that I have the quote right here. It says the U.S. has continued support of the parties to the conflict, including through arms transfers, thereby helping to perpetuate the conflict. So that may very well have some kind of legal implication down the road, that like we've helped to perpetuate this conflict with our arms sales. And that's the very thing that these officials are apparently concerned about. So I thought that was interesting.
Right. Well, and then, with the hearing this week and Mike Pompeo, it'd be interesting to see. I guess Hillary Clinton was out of office as Secretary of State by the time 2015 this war started. But, John Kerry, Joe Biden, even, then Trump administration officials, Esper, Pompeo, Trump. See who gets tied up in this. And, hopefully somebody will eventually see some justice for the people of Yemen. Before we wrap, I want to do a quick update on the Assange hearings. I believe it was Monday where it seemed like technical failures. It was actually supposed to restart on Monday after a brief couple days off because of a potential COVID. The test came back negative, but then Monday is supposed to restart. Technical errors, I guess, prevent them from really accomplishing any business. I was kind of following Joe Loria's Twitter feed that day, and it was like, they're going offline for a little bit. And then he said that the judge popped back on for a couple minutes, said that's it for the day, and that was it.
Done.
And then Tuesday, there's another great write-up by Craig Murray, who the column he's doing for Consortium News on this is titled "Your Man in the Gallery." And he's one of the, few people who actually get to get in and watch what's happening at the trial unfold. So he has... It's, I would call, a loose transcript of kind of what happened, and he inserts some of his own, thoughts in, and especially debunking some of the lies told about Assange within it. but it's pretty good. The particular thing that happened on Tuesday was the expert witness for Assange, the defense, was Eric Lewis, who has some kind of expert on kind of prisons in the U.S. and then the injustice done to people in prisons, and it seemed like Eric Lewis had like a lot of very interesting things to say, and I think it's important for the UK court system because some of the American prison systems are horrendous, and I think the Europe like there's no death penalty in Europe, like that's a part of being in the European Union. That was like a sticking point. Like after the 2016 coup in Turkey, Erdogan floated the idea of executing some people, and the EU said, well then, you won't be able to get membership. So that kind of stuff like is important. And then when the prosecutor John Lewis cross-examined Eric John Lewis, I think that's his name.
Yeah, yeah, they're both Lewis. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Cross-examined Eric Lewis. I found it to be pretty tedious in that most of his cross-examination was just trying to make excuses for people to ignore his testimony. So he would do things like ask, "What kind of detentions do you have in the U.S.?" And like Eric Lewis would answer, like, "Well, there's three general categories, which is like solitary confinement, high security, and regular, or something like that." And then John Lewis says no, and then list off 100 things. And it's like me asking well, can you name the colors? And Will says yellow, red, and blue. And I say no, that's wrong. There's magenta and pink and
right, cyan and all this stuff.
right, just turquoise, and go on and see like, look, you can't be an artist, like you don't know every single color in the Crayola 64 color bots.
That is what he's doing. That's exactly what this guy's doing.
Right. And it seemed to me like it was just like stuff like that over and over again. I gotta say, like, I really appreciate Craig Murray's write-ups, but that article was just long and boring to read because it's like, the most trivial things that he's asking him about, rather than, maybe saying like, hey, maybe the conditions are bad, but this guy is really terrible and needs to be in prison. And let's, face it, that it's not like high security U.S. prisoners drop dead every day from inhumane treatment, and I'm sure there was some kind of like minimizing argument the guy can make that was at least somewhat based in reality, but this was just kind of like a crazy waste of time in one of the most important trials to ever happen. And so it's I guess if I could describe the Assange trial as anything so far for me, it's just frustrating. It's hard to get any really good information of what's happening on there, because the only coverage you get is from alternative media sources like Craig Murray, and he does excellent write-ups, but at the same time I would like to see some video of what's going on in there, or at the at very least see more reports from more different sources. Maybe Murray misremembers something. He's, like I said, it's like a loose transcript. It'd be great if people were writing up full transcripts and stuff like that. And also, like, Craig Murray is a friend of Julian Assange. He has a bias. Not that, that makes me discount exactly what he's saying here. I think he's an honest person and everything and would write up his story honestly. But for other people, it's hard maybe for them to read it and accept it, because, he does make it obvious that he has a personal, preference that Assange be found not guilty of this. So, Will, did you catch anything in the Tuesday's Assange hearing that I missed, or is that pretty much it?
No, I think you pretty much summarized. There was nothing that I had seen that worth noting on Tuesday that you hadn't already mentioned. There was something on Monday I found kind of interesting, just like the reason why they postponed the whole thing. There was apparently like a American news report started playing through like the court sound system while this Eric Lewis guy was testifying. And like, did you ever find out what the deal was there? Someone had raised the possibility that they had been hacked or something, or that it was maybe just a glitch on the witnesses side. Did you ever figure out what happened with that?
No, I actually didn't get like a full detailed report of it. I just was kind of following along on Twitter that day, and they like kind of just reported a tech error, and then reported it wasn't coming back. So I didn't know that was exactly the thing. So it's like a Zoom call where somebody forgot to mute themselves, or
So it sounds, yeah, exactly.
man.
But But the last thing I'll say here is that like you mentioned just how like yeah it'd be great to get some video here, and isn't it odd how like there can be a random shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and we have 27 angles of it within 30 minutes the night that it happens, but here we have the most important legal case going on in like decades, and we know where it is, we know where we know who's taking part in it, but we can't get a damn video feed of it. Like I find that to be outrageous.
Right. Well, assuming that we continue to have the trial proceed and COVID and these technical issues stop getting in the way, let's continue to cover this in, the weeks ahead. I think we should be expecting testimony from Daniel Ellsberg and Patrick Coburn relatively soon. So,
Yeah.
those are some big names, and that, that'll be exciting. And hopefully, then Scott could have them on and interview those guys too, just to chat with them about what they end up, saying. Because
Yeah.
one of the things is the witnesses are very limited in what they're able to say. I think they can only give like a 30-minute testimony to the defense, like to the side that they're testifying on, before they're then cut off. And then the prosecution jumps in and is like, why didn't you talk about all this stuff that you have in your report? It's like, well, I had a half
Right.
hour. Like, what do you want me to say?
Yeah.
But so we're probably not gonna like hear everything that Patrick Coburn and Daniel Ellsberg have to say on it at the trial. But hopefully Scott could get them on the show and let them talk about the things they can't say. And man, it's I guess kind of unfortunate because I don't think it's gonna change anything, but it is kind of exciting to have Daniel Ellsberg set to testify here, and hopefully he can make some at least powerful statements, and maybe especially like Patrick Coburn, I think is a somewhat important and famous person in the UK, a little bit better known than in the US. So maybe like his testimony there will like get some more coverage, and people will be like, oh yeah, this Assange thing is a little bit important.
Right, right. Yeah, I was hoping the same thing, that maybe Coburn would bring some prestige to that, being like a well-known columnist and writer, journalist.
All right, well, that's where we should probably wrap it for today. But everybody, make sure you're following Will on Twitter at the Will Porter. He posts the stuff he writes at RT, usually early in the morning. So if you follow him and check out his account when you wake up, you'll see what he wrote the night before. Lots of interesting stuff, like the Venezuela article we followed today. You follow me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _. You can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. We're on Facebook at conflicts of interest. One of the most important things you could do is subscribe to the YouTube channel, conflicts of interest. We do a video version of this show that I think comes out really good and adds a lot to it, so make sure you check that out. We do have the Patreon page set up. We're kind of looking at different Patreon tiers and what we could do to get some money from you guys. We're looking at using a lot of the money we get, especially at first, really improve some of the quality of the show and bring you a little bit better of a product. And then we will continue to work and do some good stuff. Will, do you got anything to add?
That would be all, I think.
All right, thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.